Hey, my name is Imogen, and I want to talk a bit today about dopamine and how it relates to Parkinson's disease. So, we'll start with a little bit of a story. In 1976, there's a 23-year-old grad student who was brought into a hospital exhibiting signs of advanced Parkinson's disease, meaning that he just lost all of his motor control. The doctors were understandably pretty surprised because people don't really get Parkinson's disease in their early 20s. And the answer as for why this happened is that this was a young chemistry grad student who had an interest in recreational drug use, and he read an old paper from the 1940s about this drug called MPPP, which is a synthetic opioid. And this is before the days of the Federal Analog Act, where if something wasn't explicitly banned by the FDA, it wasn't illegal. So this kid was like, hey, I'm going to get opiates and not have it be illegal. I can just make this based off of a paper that he read. And he screwed it up a little bit, and he produced this impurity called MPTP as part of that. And that is what led to him getting Parkinson's. We'll come back to that. So we talked about serotonin last time. This is dopamine. Dopamine's another neurotransmitter. And like serotonin, it's involved in a bunch of different bodily systems. So I'm just going to talk about a couple notable ones here. So psychosis is related to dopamine. Psychosis is a break from reality. It can include hallucinations, visual hallucinations or delusions, which is mistaken beliefs that aren't really based on reality. And one of the most common drugs that's given to treat psychosis is an atypical antipsychotic, also known as a second generation antipsychotic. And these are dopamine antagonists, meaning that they block the function of dopamine. And this is what you use to treat any kind of mental illness that involves psychosis, like schizophrenia or bipolar 1. By the way, if you give somebody too much dopamine, you can actually start to see a little bit of this, which is kind of interesting to see the other side of it. It's also involved in the mesolimbic pathway, which is also known as the dopaminergic reward pathway. As you know, dopamine is really associated a lot with pleasure, reward, addiction, that sort of stuff. That sort of stuff is super interesting. I'm going to do another talk at some point later about addiction, drug abuse, that sort of stuff. Executive function. Executive function is that, as well as motivation. When you make a decision that you're able to carry it out, ADHD is theorized to be kind of related to dysfunctional dopamine processing. And then we have motor control, which is kind of what we were talking about earlier. So the rest of this lecture is going to be more focused around that. This is a bit of a creepy picture, but this is a still from a PBS story about this thing that happened in 1983 that a book was written about called The Case of the Frozen Addicts. This is a super famous case where you had a number of drug users rather, who were using opiates, and turned out that those opiates, again, this is 1983 before the Federal Drug Analog Act, they were given MPPP, which was had an MPTP impurity, and so a whole bunch of these drug users in LA, a half dozen or so, started showing up in hospitals, and they just had Parkinson's disease. And a lot of these people were pretty young too. This guy right here is a neurologist. He's the one who wrote the book, and he really made his career off of this. He's the head of research for the Michael J. Fox Foundation now for Parkinson's disease research. So coming back to MPTP, MPPP. MPPP is what they were trying to make. MPTP is the impurity. So your body doesn't really, we talk about liver function. We're it's how your body gets drugs out of itself. It's like, it's this detoxifying thing. Like your body is really not smart about things. It just tries to convert things into a form that it's easier for it to get out of its system. Oftentimes, like you're oxidizing drugs to convert them to another form that you can readily just like get out through your urine or whatever. And because your body's dumb about this, like it can often convert prodrugs, like an inactive prodrug, into an active prodrug. Your body actually converts MPTP into another drug called MPP. And MPP is a neurotoxin. And the point of all this is that J. William Langston, who's the neurologist that we saw in this picture over here, he figured out that this is what these drug users had gotten a hold of, and this was the impurity, and they took this bad batch of drugs, and that's kind of what led to this situation. And so, like, what does MPTP actually do to your brain? You have a densely packed cluster of dopaminergic neurons, aka, or like, by dopaminergic neurons, I mean neurons that produce dopamine. And it's called the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra? I always confuse the two. I think it's nigra. So without dopamine, you lose motor control. You cannot move. So like the people who were showing up in the emergency room were just like, they called this the case of the frozen addicts because like they suddenly just couldn't move. They went from being perfectly fine to the next day just being like paralyzed, basically. And what happens with MPTP is the same thing that happens in Parkinson's disease. It's the death of dopaminergic neurons of the substantia nigra. And we're still trying to figure out why this happens precisely, but there's been a lot of good progress for the last 3 decades or so, 4 decades, about how to treat the symptoms of Parkinson's disease, at least. There's a number of different drugs that are used for treating Parkinson's disease these days. One of the most common, and probably the oldest, is L-Dopa. Like you lose dopamine from Parkinson's disease, so we just need to give you more dopamine. L-Dopa in particular is a precursor. Again, like it's kind of like a prodrug where the body takes it and converts it into another form that is more useful. Specifically, L-Dopa is turned into a group of neurotransmitters called catecholamines, like dopamine, norepinephrine, epinephrine. And so here's something interesting is that you might ask, like, okay, well, like the issue is that these people just don't have enough dopamine, so why don't we just give them more dopamine? The answer is that you have this very selective membrane that separates your brain, like the blood that goes to your brain, from the rest of your body. Like it's this really selective filter so that you can get blood up there, you can get like a number of other things up there, but it keeps like, viruses, it keeps most drugs, it keeps a lot of things out of there. And this is actually like interesting from a pharmacological standpoint, that it really limits like which drugs you can get up there for treating neurological things that you want to approach. So another talk I want to give at some point is on drug discovery and some of the challenges for developing pharmacological drugs. But anyways, like this is why you hear about people getting like bronchitis fairly often, but you may not hear as much about like brain infections because it's harder for things to get up in there. So coming back to MPTP, this discovery really led to this huge renaissance in Parkinson's disease research, which had been like, in this winter for decades, really, of like, people get Parkinson's. We know that dopamine is effective for treating it, but we can't really study it because, we can't like cut up human brains from people who are living or whatever. And, there are no other animals that got Parkinson's from what we could tell. So now that we had MPTP, this means that we had an actual animal model that you can use for studying this. So that was huge for research. This was used in apes for the most part. Rats are actually resistant to MPTP-based damage. With that said, I worked in a lab when I was in university that did research related to memory stuff, and the lab that was attached to us did Parkinson's disease research, and they worked with rats. The reason why they were able to is there was this other drug, a pesticide that was discovered to work on rats called rotenone, I think. Random other little aside. This is this little white albino dude here is a species of rat called a Sprague-Dawley. We use those all the time in my lab, and it's like the classic like lab rat because it's like very docile. It's another thing I want to talk about sometime is like there's all sorts of different species of rats that are used for very specific things in research. This is the classic lab rat, like the albino one. Anyways, super rambly all over the place thing. I hope you enjoyed. I want to do more videos on more different neurotransmitters and interesting stories around them. I'll catch you later.